إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для обеспечения полного и качественного устного перевода необходимо поступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellences, distingués collègues.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I call to order the high-level intersessional panel discussion on the incompatibility between democracy and racism. Pursuant to Resolution 53/21 of the Council, entitled The Incompatibility Between Democracy and Racism, the Human Rights Council decided to convene a high-level intersessional panel discussion on the incompatibility between democracy and racism, with a view to taking stock of best practices and of the difficulties faced at the national, regional, and international levels in order to ensure the concrete, inclusive, and safe participation of people, including women and children and individuals belonging to groups that are vulnerable to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in public and political affairs, and in order to ensure their participation in decision-making in particular. The concept note for this panel discussion is available on the Council's website. I would like to remind participants that this being an intersessional meeting of the Council, we will apply the rules and practices of the Council regarding the participation of the various stakeholders in the Council's work. That being said, given the nature of this meeting, it being a panel discussion convened by the Council, I would like to recall that points of order and rights of reply are not permitted. All opinions may, of course, be expressed and, of course, they may differ. I therefore encourage all participants to intervene in an interactive and constructive way by making comments and by asking questions that are directly linked to the presentations given by the panelists and the discussions. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I have the honor of welcoming Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will deliver the opening statement. I would also like to wish a warm welcome to Her Excellency Ms. Aniel Franco, Minister for Racial Equality of Brazil, who will deliver an opening statement by video. I would like to wish a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, His Excellency Mr. José Francisco Caritzay, Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, Mr. Ibrahim Aguissé, Member of the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Ms. Anastasia Crickley, Chair of the International Council of the Minority Rights Group, and Ms. Thea Jaliashvili, First Deputy Director of the OSCE's Bureau for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the speakers list will be closed in 15 minutes. The speaking time is limited to 1 minute, 30 seconds for all, and we will hear a maximum of 40 speakers. Delegates who are inscribed on the list of speakers, but who are unable to take the floor due to a lack of time, and I doubt that will be the case, will be able to upload their statements up to the extranet. I now have the honor of giving the floor to the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights for her opening statement.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Colleagues and friends, distinguished panelists, very pleased to join this timely discussion on the incompatibility between democracy and racism. Democracy thrives or withers on the extent to which all of us enjoy our right to meaningful and inclusive participation in public and political affairs without discrimination. Such participation is essential for achieving racial justice, equality, and the commitment to pluralism ensures that decision-making becomes more sustainable and public institutions more effective, transparent, accountable, and able to serve all communities. Too often, however, we see racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance pervade democratic structures and discourse, undermining the very foundations of democracy and the social cohesion safeguarding it. Consultations convened by our office when drafting our guidance note revealed that pervasive racism continues to impede the effective participation of people of African descent in public affairs. Disaggregated data, where available, points to low levels of representation of marginalized racial and ethnic groups in political and public lives, with women particularly affected. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, for example, has noted that barriers to women's participation are in part linked to gender-based violence and to deeply rooted historical patterns of discrimination stemming from colonialism and enslavement. A recent analysis by a non-governmental organization found that disparities persist in reflecting the EU's demographic reality, with the proportion of members of the European Parliament identifying as belonging to racial and ethnic minorities remaining modest. And that, I mean, approximately 4% during the period 2019-2024. The fundamental freedoms of opinion, expression, peaceful assembly, and association are indispensable pillars of democracy. Freedom of expression is meant to empower individuals in order that they can participate in public debates, hold authorities accountable, and foster transparency in governance. However, it should not extend to incitement to discrimination, to hostility, or to violence. And yet, across the globe, we witness a wave of harmful and dehumanizing narratives that are fueling fear and division, as well as inciting hatred and violence. Those targeted are often people of African descent, migrants, refugees, Roma, indigenous people, minorities, and other groups. Toxic rhetoric is amplified by social media, and AI-generated content is also used to manipulate public opinion and exploit public fears. Some political leaders have openly emboldened discrimination for political gain. Dear colleagues and friends, I encourage all of us to use today's discussion to consider how we can urgently and effectively address these challenges to buttress effective participation of marginalized racial and ethnic groups. Comprehensive intersectional measures grounded in international human rights law and supported by adequate funding are essential. To name a few initiatives that are striving towards this goal, let me share. Last year, for example, Mexico enacted a significant constitutional reform that affirms the rights of indigenous people, recognizing them as subjects of public law with legal status and rights to self-determination. Canada has involved communities affected by racism in developing laws on the collection, use, and disclosure of data, informing the development of the 2022 Anti-Racism Data Act. In the European Union, Roma organizations have actively participated in the development of the EU framework for Roma inclusion. In Ireland, the National Action Plan Against Racism for the period 23 to 27 was informed by written submissions, an online survey, and consultations, including from individuals who had experienced racism, from civil society and community organizations. Our office stands ready to assist states, including 1, to adopt special measures and institutional arrangements that can promote and ensure equal representation and participation, and 2nd, to anchor legal and policy response in data disaggregated by race or ethnic origin in line with the human rights-based approach. We encourage states to establish or to strengthen independent national human rights institutions with adequate resources and robust mandates to combat racism and racial discrimination. National action plans against racism, if inclusive of specific time-bound commitments and effective monitoring, can also be a critical tool for moving from aspirational statements and commitments to concrete results. Complementary strategies such as education, awareness raising, and creating safe, enabling environments offline and online are equally important. And above all, we must tackle the root causes, in particular by addressing legacies of enslavement and colonialism and delivering reparatory justice. As we mark the 60th anniversary of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and look ahead to the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action next year, I call on all states to reaffirm commitment to the effective participation and representation of marginalized racial and ethnic groups in decision-making processes. I am hopeful that today's discussion will provide an opportunity to reflect, to share best practice, to advance our understanding, and most of all, to accelerate our commitment to action to end the scourge of racism. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Aniele Franco, Minister for Racial Equality of Brazil, who will deliver a video opening statement.
Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, it's a pleasure to speak to you today as we open this important discussion. This panel invites us to reflect on a truth that is both urgent and often overlooked: racism and democracy cannot coexist. Racism is not only a moral failure, it's a structural force that silences voices, blocks access to rights, and distorts the very foundation of democratic life. When entire communities are kept at the margins, democracy becomes incompetent. Democracy can only prosper when it reflects the diversity of its people. This means dismantling the systemic inequalities that have historically excluded Afro-descendants, indigenous peoples, women, and other marginalized communities from power and decision making. Brazil proudly led resolutions that bring us together today. So because of this, we believe that racial justice and democracy are inseparable. We believe that building truly inclusive democracies require international policy to promote racial equality, expand political representation, and combat hate speech and racial violence in all its forms. As a Black woman and Minister for Racial Equality in Brazil, I know representation that is not symbolic, it's transformational. Let us use this space to reaffirm our collective commitment to ensure that every voice counts and that no democracy is complete until it serves of all its peoples equally. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I now will give the floor to the panelists for their opening remarks, and I would like to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. José Francisco Carrizai. Thank you very much, Chair. It is an honor for me to be here, and I would like to also extend a greeting to my fellow panelists. It is an honor to take part as representative of Guatemala, a country which has supported the efforts of the Human Rights Council to place this topic on the international agenda, and which is acting as a co-sponsor for the resolution on the incompatibility between racism and democracy. This resolution is a key reminder of the fact that democracy can only be full when it ensures the effective inclusion and participation of all cultural and ethnic entities. In theory, democracy seeks to ensure full citizen participation, full respect for fundamental freedoms, and equal rights. However, we are witnessing the fact that in various parts of the world, this goal has not been achieved, especially from the perspective of systematic racism, marginalization, and structural exclusion. The Latin American region is still home to structural forms of political exclusion. When indigenous peoples seek to achieve political participation or defend their territories, they often are faced with lawsuits, and anti-terrorism laws are used against them. Moreover, educational systems do not recognize indigenous languages, which hampers access to healthcare in rural areas, and there is also economic inequality and low levels of political representation in decision-making fora, especially as regards vulnerable groups such as women, persons with disabilities, and also indigenous peoples who continue to face barriers when seeking to exercise their collective rights. In Latin America, we can see many positive examples. In Brazil, the Minister for the Environment is an indigenous person. In Mexico, recently, a President of the Supreme Court of Justice has also been nominated from an indigenous community. In Guatemala, there are various female civil servants in high positions who have been appointed to lead governmental agencies. However, and there's also the high-level panel as the main forum for dialogue between indigenous peoples and the authorities who meet periodically to discuss health, education, and environmental protection, amongst other things, and to promote actively the participation of indigenous women. Therefore, Guatemala would like to invite the Human Rights Council to encourage states to strengthen legal frameworks that will ensure full recognition of the collective rights of indigenous peoples and people of African descent, avoiding generic categories which dilute those rights. The Council should also ensure the participation of indigenous peoples without describing them as NGOs. At the regional level, there is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the Organization of American States. And although great progress has been made in 3 decades, we are seeing significant setbacks now. Therefore, Guatemala would like to call on the member states of the United Nations to put into practice the principle of leaving nobody behind. Only thus will we ensure democracy free of racism. Guatemala would like to firmly assert that democracy and racism are incompatible. Genuine democracy is built on equality, equity, pluralism, and justice. Thank you very much, President. I thank you, and I now have the honor of giving the floor to Mr. Ibrahim Guissé.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. It is an honor for me to take part in this high-level intersessional panel on the incompatibility between racism and democracy. I would like to thank the President of the Human Rights Council for having convened this session. Allow me first, President, by way of opening, to recall that this year marks the 100th anniversary of the Convention, which is a cornerstone of the international framework seeking to prevent racism. This 50th anniversary is the opportunity to renew its commitment to ensuring everybody is treated on an equal footing without any discrimination based on race. The Convention and the Committee have launched a number of initiatives in order to emphasize this. I would like, with your permission, President, to invite the states parties to the Convention to actively take part in the high-level commemoration that is scheduled for the 4th of December during the 100th session. Democracy and racism. Let's come to the matter at hand. It is generally understood that democracy is usually defined as a form of government for the people, by the people. However, it is not just the rule of majority, but it is a state in which all people, including minorities, are fully engaged. And that is why you have the balance of power, and people can aspire to become the leaders of tomorrow. You have to understand the fundamental pluralist nature of society for democracy to flourish. Therefore, we have to ensure that we counter measures which create exclusion in our neighborhoods, in our cities. For democracy aims to guarantee the full participation of all citizens, regardless of their origin. However, diversity, be it ethnic, cultural, or religious, is sometimes perceived negatively by a dominating majority, and this can lead to division and fault lines. It was found that new technologies are used increasingly in order to spread hate speech and also to fragilize democratic institutions. We are seeing extremist and nationalist tendencies which are articulating a xenophobic and racist discourse against a group of persons, and this is also an existential risk for democracy. So we have to address the historic roots, and we know that many societies are fascinated by history, and within societies, there are many forms of inequality that are handed down from one generation to another that are structural and that continue to produce nefarious impacts. Addressing these impacts, including through restorative justice, is also an issue here. It is important to explore the possibilities and prospects of turning our world into a better place, a world in which the architecture of global governance would be better balanced. In the African Union, in 2025 is a year dedicated to justice for African people, with a focus on reparations. Also, the new UN decade on people of African descent is beginning this year. One might wonder, how can these two initiatives offer a new framework for strategic reflection on how to address structural injustice and make recommendations on reparation? Racism involves a denial of equality, and it is based on discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity. Democracy is deformed when a particular group is oppressed. The function of the law, both national and international, is to ensure that people act in order to prevent such discrimination. First, we have to ensure legally binding protections. And secondly, you have to clearly impose upon our governments and ourselves an obligation to not act in a discriminatory way. The rule of law offers a highly necessary framework for ensuring that democracy is not but an empty wish on paper, but a reality founded on equality. It is in this vein that the Convention comes into play, as it offers a key framework at the international level for ensuring inclusive and dynamic democracies can thrive. With a high number of recommendations, 180 up to date, it is one of the most widely ratified conventions in the world and plays a key role in underscoring the incompatibility between democracy and racism. And the committee is tasked with monitoring implementation of the convention by states parties and assessing how they are acting on in terms of discrimination against multiple different communities, with a view to ensuring that all those communities can exercise their rights without discrimination. The committee draws up recommendations, in particular through their concluding observations. There's General Recommendation 35 on racist speech. There's General Recommendation number 34, number 23 on indigenous peoples and Roma. And there are also General Recommendations on xenophobia. Allow me now, President, to move on to certain best practices which our convention has pinpointed when examining states parties' reports. First of all, strengthening legislative frameworks. The convention demands that states apply laws and implement them in all areas of public and private life that counter discrimination. Anti-discrimination laws are therefore recommended, as are amendments in order to bring legislation in line with the provisions of the convention. In particular, we often find that the definition of racism is not always fully in keeping with that contained in Article 1 of the Convention. Many states do not explicitly criminalize racist discourse and hate speech, as is required by Article 4 of the Convention. The committee also notes that many states create institutions and appoint special envoys or representatives for combating discrimination. However, they are often plagued by a lack of resources, which mean they have no teeth. Thirdly, reliable data remains of the essence. Many states or many communities within states parties are invisible in the data. Although many countries have made progress by including measures to combat discrimination in their statistics, work remains to be done. The committee cannot always fully assess the situation on the ground without visits. I would also allow to underscore the importance of the full implementation of the Convention's provisions. The committee has found that there has been progress in certain fields, such as participation, but those groups that are protected by the Convention continue to suffer from discrimination and limited access to their rights. The Convention has underscored that it is important to ensure that human rights are integrated at all levels and that the history of colonialism and slavery are factored into this. The fight against racism and democracy are not only incompatible, but it is essential to ensure that the Convention is properly implemented in order to strengthen democracy. A world which is in need of peace and democracy is a place where we feel it's important for the Human Rights Council to continue to pay heightened attention to the threats and challenges that are weighing over democracy. Thank you.
De donner la parole à Madame Anastasia Craigley, s'il vous plaît, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you for the opportunity to join this very timely, it would help, sorry. Thank you very much again, Chair. And thank you very much for this opportunity to join this very timely discussion, and also to the very able speakers who've gone before me, who've covered most of the ground, thankfully. So I'll try and keep my comments as short as I can, even although I'm not well known for having nothing to say. But can I just say I'd like to commend the Deputy High Commissioner for her focus, in particular on pervasive racism and on disaggregated data, which I will return back to, and also to Francisco Calazai, whom I've known for many years, also as a member of CERD, on reflecting the need to reflect the diversity of the peoples that are part of any one country. And also to speaking also about goals that are not just yet achieved, and lawsuits that are used against people, and to Ibrahim Gusey for your reflection on the rule of law, and thankfully for your reflections and reminder of the work of CERD, which I will definitely try not to repeat, because I'll probably not remember it sufficiently to get it right. I have currently the honour to be chair of the Minority Rights Group and of PAVI Point, and I want to acknowledge the insights that I've gained through my engagement with both of these organisations, and from a lifetime of work with marginalised and minority groups, including migrants and women's groups, from the local to the global, and how these inform the comments and suggestions I will attempt to make today, as do the resolution and our regional and global covenants and conventions, in particular ICERD. I'll first of all say a little bit about my own starting points, go on to speak about racism in the context of today's discussion, and make some comments on associated issues, and then I'll finish with a few suggestions. Working as an immigrant with the Irish community in the UK of the 1970s, thus betraying my age, was a rapid personal introduction to racism, as a number of groups were wrongfully convicted, Irish people, of crimes they did not commit, and Irish accents evoked unwarranted responses reminiscent of the no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs of the 1950s. My 1980s return to Ireland, where conviction that ours was a monocultural, non-racist society, allowed deep-rooted racism against travellers to fester, illustrated for me the complexities and contradictions, which are well outlined academically, of post-colonial participation by both colonised and colonisers in reinforcing racism at every level, and the reality that this needed to be addressed not just in my country, but also regionally and globally. My commitment as a community worker to the rights of marginalised to participate in shaping and making policies affecting them has informed the work I've undertaken as an academic and a member of the international organisations, including CERD. Such participation is well reflected in the resolution that informs today's discussions, and in the General Assembly and Human Rights Council and treaty body recommendations and conclusions referred to in the associated materials. Moving on then. The states parties to ICERD have committed to the elimination of racism and racial discrimination as defined in its Article 1, and agreed to be reviewed by CERD voluntarily regarding their progress in this direction. I don't want to repeat all of this, but I think it's worth reminding us, and paraphrasing, that this commits to the elimination of preferences or exclusions based on race, colour, descent, national or ethnic origin, which have the purpose or effect of denying or impairing equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental political, economic, social and cultural freedoms. This understanding of racism, on purpose or in effect, is well grounded in the individual experiences of members of minority group, but these experiences reflect also the extent to which its reproduction by society's institutions reflect the extent to which racism is structurally embedded and in effect systemic. All of you who have spoken already have mentioned this, but I have to say it follows that initiatives to address it requires change at every level. Procedures on how work is done, policies on how policy and how they were conceived and shaped, and in the culture and thinking which inform both. Policy responsibles ultimately concerned with assimilation, accommodation or toleration, which I absolutely abhor, or cultural pluralism, which leaves differential power relations intact, cannot bring such change. It requires integration, but beyond that also acknowledging that groups experiencing racism are not only newly arrived, although all newly arrived groups do experience racism, but present for generations, to inclusion in the development of an intercultural society where diversity is celebrated. Education is often quoted as the key priority in this regard. I would not in any way downgrade education, but I think in any discussion on education, the barriers to education participation, the racism that impedes participation, not just participation, but access, participation and outcomes from education for marginalized and minority groups at each and every level need to be acknowledged. And for this to happen, it is a requirement in my understanding and in the way that we have tried to progress it in the work I've undertaken, that anti-racism education needs to be mandatory, it needs to be examined, and it needs to be part of promotional procedures in all of the roles that everybody, including all of you who work here in the UN and all of you who work as diplomats, undertake. Racism, then, is a toxic global discourse which, whatever the nature of each state today uses, it uses AI and social media to divide and instrumentalize the marginalized, whether from groups experiencing racism or groups which have been impoverished and pushed aside in the interests of power and profit by a few, or corrupt maintenance of power by the elite, as well put by Tendai Achume, then Special Rapporteur on Racism, in a 2018 report. Hierarchies of oppression serve to reinforce this, but the continuing legacies of slavery and colonialism for people of African descent and indigenous peoples continue, as the centuries-old discrimination against Roma and travellers and other associated sometime nomadic groups. The normalization of racism and of particular forms of racism and their implications for targeted groups have a resonance with the current horrors of Gaza. They were part of the drives to obliterate, which was the Holocaust of World War II, and are well understood by Roma and indigenous peoples throughout history, as well as by others globally, including Armenians and Australian Aboriginal groups. Today's focus on the incompatibility between democracy and racism is reflected in every and all understandings of democracy and its underpinnings, including the Human Rights Resolution of March 2015 and the Human Rights Council focus on what's possible as well as what needs to be stopped is, I believe, a good starting point, and one which we tried to reflect in Ireland's first National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism, saying inter alia what we were against, but also what we were for. Democracy, as the rule of law of the majority, cannot be used to undermine and violate the rights of minorities, or of minorities within minorities, including religious minorities, which can become the easy target of acceptable racism. And democracy requires the ongoing mirror of the critique civil society can provide, the creative tension which helps make it an instrument of rights, rather than the ongoing attempts which are now evident from Beijing to London and Washington, and points in between, which seek to insist otherwise. The right to participate in public and political affairs is a founding hallmark of democracy and needs checks and balances which go well beyond national and local elections, which are, of course, very important. Participation by minorities as part of the judiciary and as lawyers and attorneys is also important, as is participation in policy and programme making and shaping. The participation of the Yogic People's Development Programme in Kenyan budget processes had positive outcomes and served awareness raising about the implications of these processes well beyond that particular budget. In Ireland, traveller and Rome organisations over decades have engaged nationally with government and local authorities to address racism and realise rights. Traveller organisations sought and cross-government strategy for progress and targeted health and education strategies, and participated in their development and are now part of monitoring implementation of them. All of this was useful and informed the development of policies and actions for change, but the challenge of implementation remains. And the challenge to put in place the targets, timelines and resources required at every level to make change real in the lived experience of those the policies are for, as well as the collective progress towards full parity in Irish society, which is their right. Direct engagement in UN treaty bodies has also played an important role for travellers, leading over a period to recognition of traveller ethnicity, which the Taoiseach of the day did in our Dáil on March the 1st, 2017. Irish traveller organisations have also played leading roles in broader civil society struggles. This included work across EU member states during the 1990s, which contributed to the development of the EU directives on racism, a cause which was propelled in no small way by civil society throughout the European Union. And in Liberia, in West Africa, it was the efforts of women, including minority women, who camped outside Charles Taylor's residence that quickened in no small way the end of the then civil war. Recent EU developments include the EU Migration Pact. Civil society involvement is more tightly boundaried. The Pact's transposition and implementation is of considerable concern for democracy and migrants who could be increasingly criminalised and excluded, including through bilateral agreements now beginning to be made. I'm concerned that the associated racialisation of migration categories in this and other areas globally divides and discriminates systemically and contributes to ongoing development of control by the powerful who might be described as past and present colonisers. And I'm told I've said enough, which is probably more than the case. I'll hurry up and I'll finish as quickly as I can. There's a very concerning context, I think, at the moment with the rise of mis and disinformations and sometimes small but loud far-right movements also using the internet to extend their influence on political discourse when not in power. MRG's strategy 25-28 speaks to concern about the widening and deepening populist authoritarian trends and shrinking of civil society space. Hate crime and hate speech are on the rise globally and require robust legislation as well as the full attention to the provisions of General Recommendation 35 of CERD. There are examples of policy and practice which I'm sure we'll hear about in many states, and language also of commitment to continue on that road. Racism in all its forms has to be named and understood, also as part of the complex and contradictory construction of societies globally. The concern for disaggregated data expressed by all treaty bodies, not only to name and blame, but on the simple basis that addressing an issue demands knowing something of its extent, needs to be fully implemented by states parties to all of the conventions. Participation by racialized communities in public affairs is essential for democracy and brings benefit to all. Ways to include all, whatever their background, religion or status in the state, need and can be found, as the Council of Europe's principles on participation in local elections demonstrate. Participation doesn't guarantee implementation, but change in official culture is required. The realities of racism for and within minorities and for minority and women and girls mean that addressing racism in promoting democracy has to have an intersectional basis. I conclude by saying the language of duty bearers is easy to articulate, but the journey from needs to rights needs more consideration, courage and commitment, including with regard to whose rights come first in a world where racism has old and new faces. The language of the SDG calls us to move the furthest back forward first, and I look forward to hearing how we might do some of this. Thank you, and sorry for being so slow.
Thank you very much. J'ai l'honneur de donner la parole.
Thank you very much. I would now give the floor to Madam Ashashvili.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, it's indeed a great pleasure to join today's high-level panel discussion on the incompatibility between democracy and racism. 15 years ago, in the Helsinki Finalec, when the OSCE participating states reaffirmed the universal significance of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religious. They have agreed that lasting security cannot be achieved without functioning democratic institutions and respect for human rights. And the participating states have therefore committed to address all forms of the racism, xenophobia, and intolerance, as well as to guarantee the effective participation in public affairs of persons belonging to the national minorities and underrepresented groups. Despite those long-standing commitments and the certain progress made in the recent years, particularly to prevent and counter this phenomenon, intolerance, discrimination, and hate remains the serious and pervasive issue in the OSCE region. corroding democracy and creating the social divisions and polarization. In many places, minorities continue to be excluded from full participation in the society, which can be deepen mistrust and weaken social cohesion. As an example of this, our ODIHR 4 status report on Roma and Sinti documents that despite Roma integration strategies, EU funding, those communities continue to face discrimination and underrepresentation in the decision-making. Hate crime as the most violent manifestation of bias and intolerance also continue to affect the lives of thousands of people across the OSCE region and destroy the very fabric of our societies. They convey a message of rejection to those they target in their communities. And the hate crimes are a serious threat to the construction of inclusive and democratic societies. And if left unaddressed, they can escalate into the wider conflict. As seen from our perspective, the three key drivers behind this increase in intolerance, discrimination, and hate crime includes the harmful stereotypes and tropes among migrants, refugees, minorities, people of African descent, Muslims, Jews, and frequently disseminated both online and offline. Sadly, continued wave of anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim discrimination and hate ranging from online and offline hate speech through the damage to personal property, desecration of places of worship, to murder threats, and even homicide. Those developments exposed and exacerbated pre-existing patterns of prejudice, stereotyping, and marginalization. And of course, the underreporting and under-recording of the hate crimes across the region that states lack reliable information about the nature and scope of racist and xenophobic hate crimes. However, irrespective of those challenges, of course, there are certain tools and practices that we have enjoyed and used effectively when we are talking and considering cooperation and coordination with the participating states. And we have underlined a need for a very comprehensive and cross-cutting approach to effectively address various forms, amongst which I would like to highlight a certain three strategies. First and most, engagement and empowering with the civil society and the facilitating dialogue and cooperation between targeted communities and the authorities, which helps building coalitions across the groups, communities that might otherwise remain isolated or disconnected. Meaningful conversation between individuals, of course, challenge stereotypes, counter conspiracy theories, and reduce prejudices. For example, our 4 status report on Roma and Sinti identifies good practices that empower Roma and Sinti organizations, support human rights monitoring, and equip local authorities to involve communities in addressing local issues with the impact of fostering ownership. We have also developed another guidance on coalition buildings and has facilitating dialogue for youth from different national and ethnic minorities, cultures and religious and beliefs to foster equal, inclusive and cohesive societies. Another important tool, of course, is increasing the participation of the underrepresented groups in the policy-making processes, which is essential to more inclusive and tolerant societies. For example, when we're talking about our electoral processes, we closely cooperate and communicate with the civil society organizations and also underrepresented groups in order to look into the policy-making processes and legal development processes. Over developments, we are guided by the very clear approach. We talk and listen to minorities themselves. And we also developed a dedicated methodological tool, such as Handbook on Observing and Promoting the Participation of National Minorities in Electoral Processes. And we are about to launch the guidelines for assessing and promoting the electoral participation of Roma and Sinti stakeholders. And last but not least, of course, strengthen mechanisms and systems to address the hate crimes, amongst which I would like to highlight our annual hate crime report, which represents the largest data set of its kind on hate crimes and serves as valuable resource for policymakers, law enforcement agencies, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders. And of course, practical guidelines on anti-Roma, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, and anti-Christian hate crimes, and practical guide on hate crime prosecution at the intersection of the hate crime and criminalized hate speech. In a conclusion, allow me to stress that only with the whole of society approach, we will be able to reach the common improvements, as well as there is a need of a more inclusive, mainstream, and integrated approaches on the legal, policy, and institutional levels. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We will now begin the first segment from the speakers list. The speakers list is now closed. I will now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana on behalf of the African countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. The African Group welcomes the convening of this intersessional high-level panel discussion pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution 53/21. Democracy in all forms and practice is predicated on the principles of equality, participation, and inclusion. Racism, by contrast, is rooted in exclusion, hierarchy, and the denial of dignity. Where racism persists, whether overtly or institutionally, democracy is diminished. Mr. President, the African Group recalls the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which remains the most comprehensive framework for combating racism globally. We reiterate our call for its full and effective implementation and urge all states to integrate its principles into national democratic processes. To this end, we wish to highlight several good practices that can serve as models for democratic resilience against racism. The establishment of independent equality bodies and national human rights institutions with mandates to address racial discrimination. The adoption of anti-racism legislation that includes robust enforcement and remedies for victims. The meaningful participation of radicalized communities in political decision-making, including through electoral reform and affirmative measures. The integration of anti-racism education into school curricula and public discourse, and the collection of disaggregated data to inform evidence-based policy responses. Mr. President, the African Group reiterates its support for the mandate of the International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement and calls for its adequate resourcing. We also reaffirm our commitment to the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, whose work is vital to advancing racial equity within democratic frameworks. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. For information, colleague, I'm relatively flexible on the speaking time this afternoon because we don't have many delegations on the speakers list. Don't count on this as from next week when we go into the session. It will be the usual practice of very strict speaking times. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President, and sincere thanks to all the speakers and panelists. To be united in diversity is not just an ambition for the EU, it is our motto and reflects our commitment to democracy, equality, and human dignity. Our democratic societies cannot and must not tolerate any form of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. EU law obliges member states to criminalize racist and xenophobic hate crime and hate speech, and to provide effective and proportionate penalties. Much can also be achieved beyond legislation. Initiatives such as the EU Internet Forum and the Radicalization Awareness Network have proven highly effective in helping identify content online that may lead to radicalization and dissemination of extreme ideologies. Education and societal engagement are equally important. EU member states adopt national plans that emphasize the fundamental role of education. The promotion of civil society organizations in the implementation of anti-racism plans is essential. The EU will soon present a renewed strategy to combat racism, building on experience gained so far. And we will continue stepping up efforts and political engagement against violent extremists who fuel hatred through racism and xenophobia. And we will keep protecting and promoting our common values. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of El Salvador. President, we appreciate the panelists for their valuable contributions. We should like to reaffirm our firm conviction that democracy and racism are absolutely incompatible. Democracy, as has been said, is based on equality, human dignity, and the participation of one and all. Racism, however, means exclusion and a denial of rights. Democracy is not merely a political system, it is a moral pact, recognizing that all people have the same value and the same rights. This pact, however, is broken when racism finds space in our institutions, in our streets, or in our words. Fighting racism is not merely a moral necessity, but a democratic necessity. It requires a cultural change, firm norms, and inclusive policies that guarantee that no one be discriminated against as a result of the color of their skin, their origin, or their culture. Our Constitution, for example, recognizes equality before the law. It prohibits all restrictions based on nationality, race, sex, or religion. This mandate guides our public policy that promote full inclusion and participation of all sectors. It ensures the inclusion of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and vulnerable groups. Inclusion strengthens social cohesion and citizen participation. For this reason, we call upon all states to put together strategies on racism in their democratic governance and meet their international commitments that they ensure accountability vis-a-vis all forms of racism. I thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you. I give the floor to the delegation of the Council of Europe for a video message.
Equality is a core building block of democracy. The fact that the principle of equality was enshrined after World War II in the very first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights underlines the importance of these human rights per se. The promotion of equality and inclusion, along with the fight against racism, hatred, and intolerance towards LGBTI people, are essential for building strong and resilient democracies. In this context, the ongoing waves of hate speech need to be seen as an alarm bell. The contribution of the Council of Europe Steering Committee on Anti-Discrimination, Diversity and Inclusion and of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance to strengthening democracy is threefold. First, we help member states implement intercultural inclusion policies. This contributes to ensuring that democracy continues to be built on the engagement of all. Second, we work intensively on the political participation of minority groups. We focus on their empowerment and support them in making their voices heard. We also assist member states in the implementation of the Council of Europe standards on preventing and combating hate speech and hate crime. The last two recommendations provide guidance to policymakers on how to protect adequately people exposed to discrimination. This is a key action for the benefit of the whole society.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia welcomes the convening of this timely and important intersessional high-level panel discussion, and would like to extend our sincere appreciation to all the speakers for their meaningful contributions. Ethiopia reaffirms that racism in all its manifestations is fundamentally incompatible with the principles of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Democracy is rooted in equality, justice, inclusion, and the full participation of all peoples. Racism, by contrast, undermines these very foundations. It breeds exclusion, marginalization, and dehumanization, and erodes the legitimacy of democratic institutions and processes. As a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilingual nation, Ethiopia firmly believes that inclusion is fundamental to peace, stability, and sustainable development. We also remain a committed advocate of the African Charter on Human and people's rights, the African Union's efforts to uphold democracy and human rights, and reaffirm our commitment to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. We are deeply concerned by the alarming resurgence of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance around the world, often amplified by hate speech, extremist rhetoric, and online disinformation. These trends not only threaten vulnerable communities, but also corrode the fabric of democratic societies. In conclusion, Ethiopia reaffirms that combating racism is both a moral imperative and a foundation for genuine democracy. We underscore the need for strong legal protections, inclusive public policies, civic education, and accountable institutions in addressing systematic racism in all its forms. We remain committed to working with all partners to build just, inclusive, and democratic societies. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci. Je donne la...
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. No one is here in that seat. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will take advantage of your offer to allow us to speak longer. So
There are limits.
thank you. My delegation aligns itself with the African Group statement as delivered earlier in this intersessional meeting. South Africa participates in this meeting with indelible memories of its apartheid past, where racism and racial manifestations kept the dream of democracy afar for too long, until the attainment of freedom in the year 1994 that paved the way for a non-racial and non-sexist society. It is our view that democratic values such as equality, participation, and inclusion must form integral part of the lived realities of all peoples, regardless of race, ethnicity, or region. There is no gainsaying that democracy and racism are incompatible and irreconcilable. South Africa maintains that the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, commonly known as the DDPA, remains the most comprehensive framework for combating racism globally. Accordingly, we reiterate our call for its full and effective implementation, and we urge states to integrate its principles into national democratic processes. Mr. President, it remains of deep concern that historical injustices, including slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, continue to shape contemporary manifestations of racism. Underrepresentation of racial minorities in governance, the lack of political will to combat systemic racism, and the limited implementation of international commitments continue to undercut efforts in combating this scourge. In addition, discriminatory practices continue to hamper individuals, including Africans and people of African descent, from participating fully in the public and political life of the countries in which they live, including the lack of the exercise of their full citizenship rights. Similarly, we deplore the recurrent incidents of excessive use of force and other human rights violations by law enforcement officers against peaceful demonstrators defending the rights of Africans and people of African descent. Ignoring these realities, Mr. President, constitutes a serious indictment on states and governments and threatens the democratic gains already made around the world. Accordingly, we call on states to take urgent measures to counter these trends, including through education, legislation, and accountability mechanisms. We particularly emphasize the critical role of education in combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, in accordance with Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. My delegation supports the calls by the African Group for good practices that can serve as models for democratic resilience against racism, as articulated in the group statement delivered earlier in this meeting. Our support for the anti-racism mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, such as the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial discrimination and equality in the context of law enforcement, whose work remains vital to advancing racial equality within democratic frameworks, remains unflinching. We remain confident, Mr. President, that the convening of this intersessional meeting will shine a spotlight on the importance of strengthening the synergy between democracy and racial equality around the world. And I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante.
Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba. Thank you very much. A good afternoon to you and the panelists. I would like to avail myself of this opportunity to thank the Office of the High Commissioner for having organized this panel, and thank you to the panelists for your contributions. Racism is not just incompatible with the values of democracy, it is also so with human dignity. Despite the many mechanisms that exist in the UN to fight racism, which is an unacceptable scourge, racism persists, principally in some developed countries in which there's a proliferation of hate speech, supremacy, racial discrimination, and all of this is often institutionalized. There is police brutality against Afro-descendants, homophobia, and racial profiling, among other forms of intolerance. These countries continue to fail to recognize and offer reparation, fair reparation for the historic consequences for transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and neocolonialism. President, the Cuban Constitution prohibits discrimination in any form and for any reason. It also recognizes human dignity as a supreme value in the enjoyment of human rights. Cuba will continue to call for the full implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. We maintain our active cooperation with the Committee Against Racial Discrimination and the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council when it comes to tackling racism. Our country also will continue to participate actively and constructively in the negotiations for the necessary UN Declaration for the recognition of individual and collective rights of Afro-descendants. Thank you very much.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la délégation du Mexique.
Thank you. I call on Mexico. This is a video message.
We don't have sound.
Este valioso espacio.
We welcome this valuable space for multilateral dialogue and extend a greeting to the presidency and to all the distinguished delegations. In Mexico, our president, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, who is the first woman to be head of state in Mexico, has placed social justice at the heart of her mandate, recognizing that racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance are acts of aggression that are incompatible with democracy. Eradicating them is therefore necessary in order to build a more inclusive society. Reforms to our federal constitution recognize indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples to be as subjects of public law, which is driving their full integration in the political, social, economic, and cultural realms. CONAPRED, as part of Mexico's state and pursuant to our National Development Plan and through the National Plan for Equality and Non-Discrimination, has created normative, political, and educational tools seeking to address causes. Mexico will continue to work decisively and cooperate with civil society, with academia, and the private sector and international organizations in order to build a society that is respectful of everybody's human rights. The interpreters believes the president's microphone was off when he gave the floor.
Sorry, si vous ne m'avez pas entendu, je passe la parole.
That explains why nobody heard me. I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
We don't have mic now. Merci.
Thank you, President. My delegation would like to commend this roundtable on the incompatibility between democracy and racism. Democracy is a collective system based on inclusivity and equality, not on discrimination and exclusion. And here we'd like to reiterate the eagerness of Tunisia to combat all forms of discrimination, racial discrimination, and xenophobia as part of its constitutional commitment for equality between citizens and the protection of all persons living on its territories within the framework of the law and the national legislation and international commitments. As a reminder, Tunisia has been one of the first countries to abrogate enslavement and chattel slavery through an official document in 1846 and to adopt an organic law to combat racial discrimination in 2018. And we reiterate our support for the ICERD and for the DDPA, which has affirmed the incompatibility between democracy and discrimination. We condemn the scourge of Islamophobia and hate speech and targeting on a discriminatory basis of Muslim populations in multiple countries. For us, the tolerance and coexistence are part and parcel of democratic principles as part of the respect for the rule of law. Tunisia would like to condemn in the strongest terms the crime of genocide perpetrated by the occupying power on a racist basis against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories. We denounce this barbaric racist aggression and the policy of starvation and displacement that the defenseless Palestinian people are being subjected to, and the aggressions that did not even spare healthcare facilities and health workers. And Tunisia would like to call upon the international community to intervene swiftly in favor of a ceasefire and to allow immediate humanitarian access and to lift the repressive blockade on the occupied Palestinian territories, as we reiterate our principled position in favor of the rights of the Palestinian people, particularly its right to self-determination, and to establish an independent state on all of its territories with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. Thank you, President.
Merci.
Thank you, dear colleagues. I do invite you to keep your statements focused on the topic of this afternoon's session. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. Thank you, President. We would like to extend a greeting to the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Minister for Racial Equality of Brazil, who is with us via video, and also the distinguished panelists who shared their enriching views and experiences with us. One of the findings of the Roundtable in 2019 was about, and I quote, the rise in many places around the world of various ideologies and political parties and extremist groups and movements, including neo-Nazi groups and skinheads. 6 years on from that, strengthening the fight against racism is not just necessary, but highly fundamental. And combating hate speech requires preventing it and addressing the root causes. And one way to do so is to foster intercultural and intracultural dialogue. We know that major steps have been taken and legal frameworks against discrimination have been adopted. There's been affirmative action and recognition of diversity as a consolidating factor for society. However, structural racism persists, which limits access to justice and basic services, and to also the political representation of millions, especially migrants, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, peasants, minorities, and people living in rural areas. Today, we are confronted with new challenges hate speech online, the instrumentalization of social networks in order to spread intolerance, and also the rise of extremist movements which seek to normalize that speech. In the face of these challenges, we must recall that freedom of expression, a pillar of democracy, cannot be used as a shield for inciting hate speech or racial violence. The plurinational state of Bolivia adopted in its constitution in 2009 the form of participatory democracy that is community-based and representative through Law 018 of the plurinational order. And this redefined our democracy as an intercultural democracy on the basis of the principles of interculturality, tolerance, and complementarity. Democracy can only be full when it embraces diversity, the plural nature of every society, without any barriers that might impede the full exercise of individual and collective rights, including the right to development of peoples. Thank you.
Merci, je donne la parole.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, President. Alas, the victory over Nazism, the anniversary of the victory over Nazism is an occasion for us, unfortunately, to see how racism and discrimination on ethnic and linguistic and other grounds is continuing to be highly relevant, including in would-be democratic states. In Moldova, the anti-Russian acts have become a national policy, and this is happening with means that run counter to international law and which run counter to the fundamental human rights. In Ukraine, Russian language is prohibited in all fields of public and private life, and there is a cynical fight waged by Kiev against the Russian Orthodox Church. We are also seeing politicians who are speaking out in favor of constructive dialogue with Russia who are being silenced. And in particular, there was the sentence handed down to the head of the head of Gogozia. We are continuing to see how the media space is being cleansed. 17 Russian-speaking television channels were closed down in Moldova. Russia calls on the Human Rights Council and other human rights mechanisms to pay attention to the violations of Russian speakers in Moldova and Ukraine. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je passe maintenant à la liste des orateurs.
Thank you. I now move on to the list of NGOs and human rights institutions, and I would like to remind everybody that the topic of today's meeting is the incompatibility between democracy and racism. And I now give the floor to Qatar National Human Rights Committee for a video message.
تفضل. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Peace be upon you all. The National Human Rights Committee in the state of Qatar is honored to participate in this important panel discussion, which sheds light on one of the fundamental issues in our contemporary societies, namely the relationship between democracy and combating racism. We in the committee believe that democracy is not complete unless it is based on equality and justice and provides all members of society with the opportunity to participate effectively without discrimination or exclusion, because the democratic experience, whatever its nature or form, must always strive to embrace diversity and ensure representation for all. At the same time, we recognize that every country has its own particularities and circumstances, and that the paths for democratic transformation may face challenges or require time. But what must remain constant is the commitment to fundamental principles of respecting human dignity, safeguarding freedoms, and working to strengthen institutions of community participation. The National Human Rights Committee is keen to support any steps that enhance dialogue and understanding and consolidate a culture of rights and citizenry and stand against any practices that may lead to discrimination or exclusion on any basis. We hope that this panel discussion is an opportunity to exchange practices and lessons learned, and to affirm that real democracy cannot be separated from the respect for human rights and the fight against all forms of racism. Thank you.
I will give the floor to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission.
Mr. President, Madam Deputy High Commissioner, distinguished colleagues. At this critical moment in world affairs, when populism, unilateralism and racism are growing in strength, forums such as today's afford us the opportunity to observe common challenges, share successful efforts and forge new partnerships in defending our core democratic values. It is not a coincidence that the rise of racism and intolerance has coincided with the failure of many states to address deepening economic inequality and their failure to vindicate the human rights to housing, health, and basic income. If democratic states cannot hope to defeat racism unless they can demonstrate their capacity to deliver sustainable development for all. Economic inequality causes a breakdown of trust in political leadership and the mechanisms of democracy itself, leaving space for division, discontent, and political polarization to flourish. We must recognize, too, that at moments of political or economic uncertainty, anti-democratic actors can exploit division and fear with unprecedented speed and reach through online hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation. States and regional and global institutions need to prioritize the effective regulation of online hate speech and mis and disinformation and the internet platforms on which they spread. Finally, investment in human rights education can lay the necessary groundwork to nurture an inclusive and democratic society. Media institutions and public representatives have a particular responsibility in how they frame narratives on issues of migration, international and temporary protection, and the rights of ethnic and religious minorities. In our common struggle against racism and anti-democratic forces, courageous leadership is needed now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply appalled and saddened by the rise of the evil scourge of racism and racial discrimination, which has no place in a democratic world. Democracy and racism are fundamentally incompatible, and where racism persists, democracy itself is undermined. We remain especially concerned by the numerous challenges and barriers that continue to obstruct progress in combating racism and racial discrimination. These challenges weaken good practices and threaten the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action in its entirety. Most notably, there is a lack of adequate publication, distribution, and resourcing of the DDPA. Far too often, decision makers do not have access to this vital document. How can we expect informed and principled decision-making if the very framework guiding the fight against racism is not in their hands? Equally troubling is the disinformation and misinformation surrounding the DDPA, which distorts its purpose and weakens international commitments towards its goals. Mr. President, the DDPA must be well known, widely available, and properly resourced to tackle the challenges addressed today. To this end, EFORD and Geneva International Center for Justice recommend that member states and the UN allocate dedicated funding for the publication, translation, and broad dissemination of the DDPA, and that training and awareness raising on the DDPA be integrated into decision-making processes at national, regional, and international levels. Only then can this landmark document serve as a guide toward good practices and address challenges in pursuit of a healthy democracy. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Human Rights Institution of Catalonia by video.
Humanos aprobó la resolución.
20 years ago, the Human Rights Commission adopted Resolution 2005-36 entitled The Incompatibility Between Democracy and Racism. In that resolution, the Commission said it was alarmed by the rise of racism and xenophobia in political circles and public opinion and society. Today, it's more than just a question of alarm. Governments of member states of the United Nations are headed by people who use their economic and political clout, not just in words, but also through actions, to dehumanize people who historically have been discriminated against. These hate ideologies don't just corrode human dignity, but they undermine the fundamental principles of our democracies. All these leaders and politicians who today use such hate speech also trample all over democratic institutions, the separation of powers, or the limits of that human rights impose on the abusive exercise of power. We need to firmly reaffirm that political platforms that are based on or praise racism and xenophobia are incompatible with democratic order. Hate speech is not protected by freedom of expression, and we must firmly condemn any ideology that promotes racial supremacy. But words and opprobrium are not enough. If we don't want to repeat tragic moments from history, we must take consistent action from the individual level to the collective global level in order to turn the tide back on disinformation and the attempts to discredit equality, human rights, and democracy. Democracy hampers racists. Let's be Democrats and anti-racists. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to international lawyers.
Thank you.
Mr. President, I would like first of all to thank the OHCHR for organizing this high-level panel discussion on the inconsistency between democracy and racism. Democracy is not only a procedural system, it has principles of value that is predicated on equal treatment to all with no regards to their race or ethnicity. When racism is entrenched in policies and social structures, it undermines the foundations of democracy. In this respect, civil education that counters racism is highly important to build resilience against racism and fanaticism. Those people in office who are discriminating against others on ethnic or sectarian grounds must be held accountable. Durban principles must be educated, and the Durban Declaration must be implemented in practice. In defending democracy, we have to refer to the the spread of hate speech based on religious discrimination. This undermines the rule of law and the democratic institutions. Therefore, the Iraqi institutions is indeed a glaring example for what we are talking about. Sectarian discourse is soaring during the election times. Therefore, we call for comprehensive legislations to counter discrimination if we are to build a real democracy. This includes equal opportunity for all, to education, to health, and to political participation. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Association Manoa for Human Rights and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. President. At its epicenter, democracy is built on the belief that all people are equal, with equal voice, equal value, and equal rights under the law. Racism directly opposes this. It is an evil concept that already exceeds personal bias and is deeply entrenched in political systems, thus distorting said systems to further encourage inequality. In highlighting that these two concepts cannot coexist in the same sphere, we as an international community must enhance our actions in combating racism. In the 2 years following the establishment of this resolution, the world continues to see a rise in racism and hate-driven crime. Extremely racist rhetoric continues to be pushed across different platforms to which people of color are continuously reduced to less than human. Political and prominent voices in the world mirror these rhetoric and further spew hate towards these different marginalized groups, fostering an atmosphere where racism is tolerated and to an extent accepted. How many lives need to be lost because of racism? How many people can this community afford to lose before states properly address this issue? Therefore, Maona and Geneva International Center for Justice call on states, their representatives, and the stakeholders to ensure that states uphold the good practices of the DDPA and address the issues of racism. Bear in mind that as reiterated by Resolution 2920, of racism and the deliberate dehumanizing of people fundamentally contradicts the principles of human rights accordingly. Thank you.
Merci. Nous avons
Thank you. We have come to the end of the first part of our list of speakers, and we will move straight on to the second part, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Belgium would like to thank all of the panelists for their presentations, and my state aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. Racism and discrimination cannot be tolerated, in particular because they run counter to the fundamental principles underpinning a democratic state. Despite progress achieved, many challenges remain in the fight against racism, including certain systemic ones. The Belgian government has committed to developing a new interfederal action plan that is ambitious and effective against racism, discrimination, and intolerance. The involvement of civil society is essential for this process to succeed. Belgium, therefore, financially supports civil society organizations and other relevant stakeholders who combat racism. In this field, the services tasked with law enforcement also play a key role. Belgium recently hosted a visit by the Independent Expert Mechanism of the United Nations on racial equality in justice and law enforcement, EMLA, and this highlighted best practices and challenges. Belgium will continue to cooperate with the UN bodies tasked with the fight against racism, and we encourage all other member states to do the same. I thank you. Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Armenia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance. We remain deeply concerned that despite global efforts, manifestations of ethnic and racial hatred threaten peace and development, undermining social cohesion and stability. Racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance are incompatible with the principles of rule of law and Charter of the United Nations. We recognize the crucial role of education in combating racism, xenophobia, and all forms of discrimination. The government of Armenia continues to undertake targeted efforts to promote equal access to quality education for all. We underscore the importance of upholding the principles of international human rights and humanitarian law. In fragile environment, racial hatred fuels targeting, incitement to violence, and even atrocity crimes against protected groups. We would also like to stress the role of regional and global human rights mechanisms and monitoring bodies. In the course of the last years, Armenia underwent the reviews in the third as well as the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, and we are working on the follow-up of the recommendation. We also try to bring our positive contribution to multilateral initiatives, being strongly convinced that fight against racism should be at the center of any efforts for conflict prevention and reconciliation. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Mr. President, our meeting today comes to reaffirm our common values. And in order to achieve that, we have to realize plurality and respect. And the Council must rise up to its responsibility to uphold these human rights values without undermining any values. This session plays an important role to protect human rights and democracy, and by criminalizing hatred and hate speech, inequality and discrimination. True democracy cannot be predicated on exclusion or discrimination. It is not an electoral mechanism. It is a system of values and a basis for the development of societies that is premised on human dignity. Where racism spreads, it undermines the foundations of democracy and opens the door wide to discrimination and racism. Jordan believes that social cohesion can only be realized by mutual respect. In this respect, Jordan has been maintaining the freedom of religion and belief and interculturalism. Common initiatives have been launched to enrich diversity. Our common responsibility today is to place the human being back into the center of good governance. We believe that coexistence can only be realized on inclusion rather than exclusion. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Colombia. Thank you, President. Distinguished panelists. In Colombia, our political constitution of 1991 paved the way towards creating new fora for citizen participation in the context of participatory democracy, which has given a more active role to citizens in political decision-making and in building a more representative state, inclusive of people of African descent and indigenous peoples. Therefore, we reject all forms of racial discrimination as well as violent and discriminatory practices that are of a racist nature. We reaffirm our commitment to complying with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, as well as the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action Against Racism and Xenophobia, and the Declaration of the Second Decade on People of African Descent. We are also promoting a declaration on the rights of peoples of African descent. Colombia has called on states for them to directly tackle the consequences of colonialism and slavery, which are manifest in socioeconomic inequalities, marginalization, and violence. In 2023, the Colombian government created the intersectoral government of historic reparation at the national level. When we speak of reparation, we're talking about the measures and actions that seek to compensate the descendants of victims of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism, amongst others. We will therefore continue to promote the agenda of reparative justice in various international fora. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I now give the floor to NHRIs and NGOs. I now give the floor to Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. This is a video message.
The Human Rights Commission is grateful for the opportunity to restate that democracy and racism are opponents. We are witnessing racism and xenophobia in Northern Ireland. In 24-25, the number of racist hate crimes and incidents reached their highest level since recording began 20 years ago. We see social media as being used to incite hatred and mobilize violent disorder on our streets. We've seen a growing number of so-called anti-immigration protests, resulting in intimidation and violence towards people from minority ethnic backgrounds, including at their homes and businesses. It's fueled by misinformation and hate, advances no legitimate debate, and violates the rights of some of our most vulnerable people. Whenever we see it, we must be honest and courageous and call it what it is: violence, disorder, criminality, not protest. Otherwise, this demeans us all. In Northern Ireland, some of the problem is systemic. For example, minority ethnic people are underrepresented in public life. That means our institutions do not reflect the diversity of the people they serve. We lack ethnic equality monitoring, which leaves some communities invisible in the data that shapes policy. We must condemn and punish racism in all its forms and take proactive measures to tackle harmful, misinformed rhetoric. If we do not tackle it effectively, it will condemn society to living in hate, deprived of the wonderful contribution migration brings.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Ed.
Thank you. I give the floor to the group from Congo, also video message. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to express on behalf of the humanitarian aid for the vulnerable of Congo, as well as the youth of Congo. We thank the Human Rights Council for this initiative, which reminds us how democracy and human rights are indissociable. In our country, the DRC, we are facing a dramatic reality in the east, where terrorists or territories, as interpreted, are occupied by armed groups. In these areas, the most basic human rights are trampled on. There are killings, massive displacements, sexual violence, forced recruitment of children, and people who are denied access to education and healthcare. These systematic violations show that the absence of respect for human rights makes fragile social cohesion. It prevents all form of local democratic government. Where human rights are not guaranteed, democracy becomes an incomplete, unmet promise. We call upon member states to strengthen the protection of civilians in conflict areas, and in particular, children and women. The international community, we call upon the international community to support peace and reconciliation efforts, fighting against impunity. We also call upon the Council to recall with force that democracy cannot flourish without the effective guarantee of human rights for all. Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Tamoul en France Association video message.
This this panel, the incompatibility between democracy and racism resonates profoundly with the experience of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The word democracy comes from demos, the people, but in Sri Lanka, democracy has been reduced to majoritarianism. Successive governments have made politics out of race, using Sinhala Buddhist nationalism to secure power and oppressing the Tamil people in the process. The new government came to power promising that it was pro-Tamil, that it would end racism and build brotherhood. Yet in reality, it continues the same policies as its predecessors. This government deceives the international community by speaking of inclusion, while in practice it builds its diplomacy on Buddhist supremacy and singular linguistic dominance. When Tamil politicians or defenders speak of the Tamil race, the government calls it racist. But when it speaks of an inclusive society for all Sri Lankans, what it means is erasing Tamil identity. Under this forced formula, Tamils are denied the distinct language, history, and culture. This erasure is unacceptable because Tamil is the world's oldest living language with written records dating back over 5,000 years and roots reaching to the 3rd millennium BCE. Instead of celebrating this heritage, Sri Lanka seeks to bury it, just as it seeks to bury the truth of the genocide and the disappeared. Until accountability for these crimes is ensured and until Tamil identity is fully respected, democracy in Sri Lanka will remain only a mask for oppression. Democracy and racism cannot coexist. One must give way. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. We hail the convening of this important intersessional panel. We'd like to commend Brazil for its leadership. We are met at a worrisome time marked by an increase in political parties that have openly racist and discriminatory agendas against migrants and refugees, as well as by attacks and campaigns with defamation against elected parties that are of African or Muslim descent. For people to enjoy their human rights, they must be fully aware of their rights. For the UN program for the fight against racism, and first and foremost, the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action be effectively implemented locally and nationally and internationally, it must be constantly in the mind of the decision makers around the world. The DDPA is among the least well known of such documents from the UN. It is often a victim of deliberate disinformation as well. We are convinced that if a sincere effort can be made by the decision makers regarding the implementation of the DDPA, we would be in a much better position to vanquish the racist poison that continues to make victims of people the world over. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Shanchi Patriotic Volunteer Association, a video message.
Mr. President, respect the chairman, distinguished delegates. I'm the founder of the International Patriotic PAC organization, and it's an honor to participate in the event. Democracy is the crowning success of human political civilization. At its heart lies people's rights, fairness, justice, etc. While racism violates the principle of equality, fosters discrimination and prejudice. Our motto is loving one's own country without harming other nations' interests. We understand that patriotism should rest on respect on the sovereignty interests of other countries and on joint development. We promote exchanges and understanding among people. We have recently organized study tours to Afghanistan and the minority regions in China. We found that Afghanistan has lagged behind due to long-standing racial conflicts, and the minority regions in China have suffered meddling by external forces exploiting racial issues. In China, however, democracy has enabled all ethnic groups to coexist equally. The government has promoted the development of minority regions. This is a compelling example of democracy prevailing over racism. Internationally, we have initiated International Patriotic Pact, and it has received support from 116 NGOs in 50 countries. Let's work together to counter racism with democracy, uphold the international patriotic principle of life as a country.
We have exhausted our speakers list. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, that was the last speaker that we have the time to hear today. I would recall to you that the delegates, I'm sorry, that was a different document. I will now give the floor to the panelists anew for their concluding remarks. I ask you to limit your remarks to 3 minutes. I would ask Madam Dayashvili to take the floor first, please.
Thank you. No, I think it was extremely inspiring, and I do not want to be repetitive, but I think that only by means of, in a very coordinating and cooperative manner, the things has to be improved, advanced, and what we need actually is to work really on all three layers, on the policy level, on the legislative framework level, on the institutional level, and of course, importance of engaging and having a close dialogue with the civil society organizations is of utmost importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Anastasia Cragley, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded listening to you speak, and I found your comments very interesting, that racism is also an abuse of power, and that addressing racism in all its forms means also addressing the systemic power that goes with it. And in that regard, I'm struck very much by the extent to which all of you states have committed to implementation of things like the ISARD and a variety of other things. I think first and foremost, coming from today, it strikes me that as well as the GDPA, which has been well discussed, that it's fundamentally important that you implement the commitments that you've made in the conventions that you have adopted and that you have ratified. Secondly, it strikes me that the move that has happened since 2019, or since the last time it was possible to have a panel here, that the instrumentalization of racism has increasingly happened, and with great speed, due to AI and due to the internet, as was already said. But this has amounted in a number of ways to extending that toxic division that exists between the marginalized groups. And I feel that what's really important there is the point made by my colleague from Ireland with regard to addressing other issues as well, so that collective collaboration can happen. Thirdly, it requires in any way a whole of government approach, which acknowledges also that racism, particularly since 2019, is not, well, and before that, is not just an issue for citizens. It's also an issue for migrants and for non-citizens in all of the member states. And lastly, I think we are called to that sort of whole of government approach, which acknowledges that all forms of racism cannot just be addressed by one general approach, that in effect one has got to look both at racism in its entirety and also at the discrete forms that it takes at different points in time, including the intersection between racism and a variety of other manifestations of oppression. Thank you.
Thank you much, Mr. Guisset.
Thank you very much, President. And thank you to the other panelists. I'd like to thank all the states as well that have spoken. Thank you for speaking on behalf of your respective groups as well. Thank you for your renewed commitment to move forward with these recommendations and to offering us recommendations. Many have put on the table food for thought. There's a global trend in the world, as many have said, an increase in racism and supremacy. We must combat this narrative. And as I said in my preliminary remarks, the United Nations and its instruments must participate in efforts to combat this. I thank you, President, and I thank the rest of you as well. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said. The conversation was rather positive. I do think that there is much row yet to hoe. However, we must review many of the elements that we have shared here in this venue. We must be clear that there are different forms of discrimination. The topic here in this panel, this high-level panel, is specifically racism and racial discrimination. I believe that there are other types of discrimination, economic, religious, that also must be addressed. However, I think that we need to focus on the matters that we have before us today, here. I merely would like to say that there are numerous items that called my attention. There are numerous, or rather there is one thing in particular that I want to underscore. This year, the member states of the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination have elected an Indigenous person. And I think that we need to welcome this and commend this. Anew, there is an Indigenous in another treaty body, but it's just one among the 180 experts that are part of the treaty body. So I would invite states to continue to put forth Indigenous, Afro-descendant candidates, men and women alike, so that they can be part of the treaty bodies. I thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, that brings us to the end of this intersessional debate. I should like to thank the Deputy High Commissioner, Minister Franco, the distinguished panelists, speakers, and all participants that have contributed to our discussion today. I adjourn this high-level debate on the incompatibility of democracy and racism. Thank you to one and all, and have a good evening.